Hello and welcome. My name is Sarah Muir and I'm on the Planning Institute of British Columbia's board. And I'm your host for today. I've been asked to come and to welcome you and to start with the land acknowledgement. So with that, I would like to say that the Planning Institute of British Columbia recognizes, acknowledges, and appreciates that we're able to live, work, and learn on the traditional territories of the First Nations and Indigenous peoples of BC and the Yukon. I want to acknowledge and respect that we're gathered on the traditional and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples, whose traditional and cultural processes and relationships with the land continue to this day. Acknowledging the principles of truth and reconciliation, we recognize and respect the history, languages, and cultures of the First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all Indigenous peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our lives, this region across the Lower Mainland, and our country. So as I mentioned, I'm on the PIBC board. This is my 5th year and halfway through my 3rd term on the board. We gathered last year to identify our strategic priorities, to update the strategic plan and identify our priorities. These are my colleagues, the smiling faces. We're led by President Emily Aiden. I want to acknowledge Dave Crosley, too, our executive director here. We came together last year to, again, update the strategic plan and identify our strategic priority areas moving forward, our mission and our value. So we aim to see PIBC as a thriving organization, supporting professional planners to manage change in support of more resilient, connected, inclusive, and vibrant communities. And we are aiming to do that through 3 strategic priority areas. We aim to pursue justice, equity, diversity, decolonization, and inclusion on the board. We're looking to enhance value, engagement, and recruitment of the membership, to deepen our relationship and understanding of what your needs are, and to implement the peer learning network, which has brought you here today. And we're aiming to advance the profession, building relationships with the province, the Yukon Territory, and allied organizations to advance the profession across the province and across Canada. We aim to raise our profile and our organization. And with that, as you may know, the province of BC and the Ministry of Housing has partnered with PIBC to develop and implement the peer learning network. It's meant to support local government staff and colleagues across the province to share knowledge and case studies with regard to new housing development and the approval, with the new housing legislation and development approval legislation. I want to say how grateful the board is for the hard work and dedication of our executive director, of Dave, working with esteemed Christine Agnello. They committed to developing and launching the PLN. And I want to thank City Spaces, who are here today. They've been helping to engage with the speakers and develop today's agenda, and they'll be facilitating and keeping notes of today's discussion. I want to thank our speakers, too, who are joining us to share their knowledge and case studies and information about the legislation today. In terms of activities that we've hosted, we had a very successful first PLN webinar, Ask a Lawyer, that was held in February. The webinars has been recorded and the presentations can be accessed from the website. We hosted our first of these regional in-person workshops in Prince George at the end of February. We were in Victoria on Friday and Kelowna on Monday, here with you today. And we're also looking to host virtual sessions in the coming months tailored for and focused on regional districts and rural areas across BC. And my understanding is we may be traveling to the Kootenays also for an in-person session. We're continuing to build out the P&L webpage and the website, adding links and resources and materials gained from the insights from these discussions, as well as information and resources that we get from our partners and additional external organizations. If you have information or if you have questions, don't hesitate to email peerlearning@pibc.bc.ca. Again, that's peerlearning@pibc.bc.ca. And with that, I will pass it on to Susie, who will go through the details of today's agenda and introduce our speakers as well. So thank you very much.
All right, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming. We're excited to be here and appreciate you spending the Thursday before the long weekend discussing this important topic. So as Sarah mentioned, PIBC has hired City Spaces to help with the organization and facilitation of these events. And in terms of the City Spaces firm, we do community planning, we also do development consulting and engagement and facilitation. Yeah, we are excited to be here. We have a number of City Spaces staff that I just wanted to introduce. We have Janelle Dirksen, our senior planner. We have Kevin Green at the back, a senior analyst. We have Zara, and we have Jess Glover at the back there, and Andre is, there. So they will be supporting in the small group discussions and also be taking some photos. We won't get any close-up photos of you, just kind of backs of head, but if you really want a photo, you feel free to come up. And if you don't want a photo, please let us know as well. So our role as facilitator is to create a safe space for dialogue, and really the event of today is to hear from our speakers, but also to learn from each other. This is all kind of new ground for all of us, so we want to learn together as we move forward. And in the spirit of that, we did create City Spaces, created a summary table that we put on your table, which kind of just provides a bit of an overview of all the legislative changes. So yeah, hopefully that will kind of help synthesize the information. If you have any questions or comments on that, let us know. And feel free to take a copy or take a photo of that as well. In terms of the housekeeping for today, we will be doing a video recording of the presentations. However, the audience and breakout discussions will not be recorded. During the question and answer period, the camera will be fixed on the podium, but there may be some audio captured. We have coffee and water and tea, and at the break we will also be having some snacks, some cookies and things. And then the bathrooms are located out there, kind of down the hall and to the left. And if there's anything that you need from us, just please let us know in terms of the temperature or any other requirements you might have. So I'm just going to go to the agenda slide. So for today, we have presentations. We'll start with Johannes Schumann from the city of Burnaby, and then we'll go to Timothy Luck, who's with Young Anderson, and then Ian Holl from the district of Sechelt will present. So about 50 minutes for each of the presentations, and then we'll have a Q&A for the panel discussion, and we have microphones that you can either come to the standing one or we have roaming ones as well. And then at 2:20, we'll have a break. And then after that, we will do our breakout sessions. And so we'll put topics at each of the tables. So based on the results from the Mentee poll, you can assign yourself a topic at each table. And then we'll have time for kind of a report back, large group discussions, and then closing remarks. And then, hopefully get us out maybe a few minutes early and we can, start the long weekend. So. Thank you, and I will turn it over to Johannes. Good.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you for having me. My name is Johannes Schumann. I'm Director of Neighbourhood Planning and Urban Design with the City of Burnaby. And so some of you might have heard some talks at UBCM Housing Summit related to this issue, and it's become a key focal point for the City of Burnaby and most municipalities across BC, but maybe what I can do today is give you some insight in how we've approached the provincial legislation and how we have some insight in the fact that we don't have all the answers, nor does the province have all the answers, nor do you have all the answers, and it's a bit of a process of muddling through, so we'll sort of show you how we've been muddling through this process ourselves. I was lucky enough to be on the DAPR group as well as DFRC with the province, so I had a little bit of foreknowledge about the legislation coming forward, and as a result, the city took the position to actually hive off and split a division within the planning department to create my group that specifically is dealing with the provincial legislation and all the other bylaws that come from it. And that's a very unique position amongst most municipalities. And I know that a lot of municipalities don't have that resource to do that. We're a team of 5. We're underdoing the zoning bylaw, OCP land use framework, TOA designation bylaw, works and services bylaw, and various other components, the ACC, DCC work. So we're actively involved in all those processes to ensure that they get done. And I'll show you some of the benefits and why we've sort of tackled this early. But what I'll do is split the presentation into two parts, a quick overview of how we interpret the legislation and what we've done sort of about it. So as you know, on November 30th of 23, the province enacted changes to the LGA under Bills 44, 46, 47. And this new legislation fundamentally changes how we plan our city, how we can improve development, how we finance growth. These are critical changes. It's a once-in-a-generational change in how we approach land use planning in the province, and we've sort of embraced that. The topics of the legislation, as you know, small-scale multi-unit housing, transit-oriented area densities and parking restrictions, the prohibition on public hearings, development financing through updated DCCs and a new ACC tool, as well as a cadence of updates to the housing needs reports, OCPs, and zoning bylaws on a 5-year and 25-year horizon. I'm not going to go through this in detail because you guys know what the legislation says. So it's the 3, 4, and 6 units depending on the lot size and proximity to frequent transit, and the prohibition of parking within certain distances of transit. The big focus for all of us that work in municipalities is that we must have a bylaw enacted by June 30th to pre-zone sites to allow for small-scale multi-unit housing. So what have we done about that? Like most of the municipalities in the Lower Mainland, there have been those that advanced housing choices programs early. We were kind of late to the party with respect to suites and laneway homes. So we started our housing choices program about a year ago and then promptly canceled it as we advanced the knowledge of the new legislation and pivoted to a singular district approach. So coming to our Planning and Development Committee next week will be a new zoning bylaw for what we call our R1 district that approaches all development under what was previously single and two family to allow for 1 to 6 units on that lot in addition to row housing. So this is something that we felt quite passionate about. It was the right change to make. As I was mentioning to other panelists, we see 106 machinations of different variations you can have on a lot. That's a lot, and how we group those into sort of 6 pools to how we approve applications between 1 and 6 units. In doing so, again, we started that work probably in November, December, and we're now complete, ready to go forward with that bylaw amendment today. It doesn't have to be perfect. It has to get done with the knowledge that this legislation, the province doesn't know all the details, that we're going to sort of make adaptations as we go. So the proposal is that we do our R1 district, we bring in our multifamily districts for TOA thereafter, and we have a full zoning bylaw update by 25. That can then amend the previous amendments we had to make sure that we're capturing updates to legislation. With regards to the next one is TOA, or transit-oriented areas. As you guys know, I'm not going to go through this in detail. It's the prescribed height and density within 2, 4, and 800 meters of a specified TOA. How we've sort of approached that, same thing, we have to designate the TOAs by June 30th. We took a different tact here, where I think my first perspective was we should update our OCP land use framework to adapt to the TOA designations. But I realized quite quickly that it's better just to look at how to bring forward the provincial legislation, adopt that by bylaw, and then flow from that OCP land use framework changes. Because if, I'm going to note at the end of this presentation, we see this as a catalyst for change. It's an opportunity for us to think about planning differently, think about our core needs and how we sort of represent those needs to our residents. And so we do what we have to do now and then adapt that more broadly through a consultation process, knowing we don't have a lot of time. These were just examples of what's in the legislation with relation to the height and density within the TOA areas, and there's an example of a TOA designation map the province brought out. We're right now going to bring forward that TOA designation bylaw in May, which will have very similar concentric circles to this, just identifying the properties that fall within those boundaries and just note specifically how it meets the height and density prescribed by legislation. As I said, following up thereafter in a couple of months with the OCP land use designations that follow. So we don't want to necessarily do the land use planning now, just recognize what we have to do, follow that up quite quickly with that land use framework change. So as I mentioned a bit, we've done the R1 district, which is going to our planning committee now. We're following up in July with new R2 through R9 districts that will replace residential multifamily. So there'll be no more RM versus R. There'll just be a whole segment of R districts 1 through 9, which will then correspond to the heights either prescribed by the legislation or what we feel aligns with our OCP. And that's a very easy way. And one of the big moves we're looking to make here, and as I keep talking about catalysts of change, we're trying to revisit, well, if we're doing this in a very short period of time, what do we actually need in a zoning bylaw? You don't need as much as you think. So we're thinking of a height-based framework and setbacks. We're actually thinking about removing floor area ratio and gross floor area completely from our bylaw. That is a fundamental change, but something that's often used in the US as a form-based code. We're looking to go down a very similar path of a form-based code in Burnaby. It enables us to meet the provincial legislation and give a lot more freedom in the market. So that's yet to come, and a lot of details on that I'm happy to explain at a later date. For now, that's sort of the framework of how we're approaching zoning. The next big item was the prohibition on public hearings. That's a big one. So the prohibition on public hearings was primarily residential, was required by the province. Essentially, council came back and said, well, how many public hearings do we have on commercial and industrial sites? We have about 5 a year. So they've passed a recommendation to essentially not hold public hearings, with the exception of those that are mandated for OCP, heritage revitalization, phase development agreement. The only things we're going to hold a public hearing for, that we won't hold public hearings outside of that. But enhancing the process and how we communicate with our residents, improved notification, improved web notification, and opportunities to have community meetings to try to fill that gap where we're missing in the public hearing. It's been relatively well received, so we haven't held a public hearing right since the legislation came forward. We've not received one complaint about people who don't have a voice at council, which is very strange, because we've opened up our doors to say, come see us, come see planners, and we're more than happy to speak with you. The big topic, I guess, is the one that Burnaby's really been a leader on, is moving forward with the DCC and ACC bylaws. And as you note in the legislation, there's some expanded DCC potentials, including fire and police and solid waste and recycling, as well as the ability to fund certain highway infrastructure through a cost share with the province, as well as the amenity cost charges as a way of sort of replacing community amenity charges, or CACs. Burnaby never prescribed to the CAC approach. We were very strict to 482 in the LGA. Density bonusing, and now we're looking how do we use the ACC tool in addition to a density bonus tool that's voluntary in specific locations throughout the city. So that's kind of the tack that we've taken. In that amendment to our R2 through R9 districts, the new multifamily districts, we're going to be outlining specifically where ACC and where bonus applies in those regards, making very clear and transparent. Jumping out of the gate, though, we essentially established updated DCC and ACC rates. We'll be going forward to the inspector next week with our ACC rates. So we have the bylaw adopted by council, we're ready to go. And this reinforces the position, get it done, don't necessarily get it right. This is one of many amendments and changes we're going to make before our OCP is adopted. So essentially bringing forward a value that we think is going to capture those applications that come in. Once we're required to have TOA and small-scale multi-unit by June 30th, we can capture ACC and DCC charges and then adapt it as we go towards adoption of our new OCP. These are the rates that were established, and we've done a municipal scan. It falls roughly in the middle of most municipalities within the region. So it's not the highest of the list, it's not the lowest, but still we do get a lot of pushback from the development industry because we didn't have a really structured DCC program in the past. The other big work item is the alignment of housing needs reports, OCP, and zoning bylaw. And as I mentioned, the zoning bylaw aspect, we're breaking up into 3 parts: small-scale multi-unit, then multifamily commercial, then the rest. We'll have the zoning bylaw updated by 25, and we commensurately have an updated OCP that's going to be done in 25. And we have teams of about 2 people working on our zoning bylaw. We have a team of 5 people working on our OCP. Sounds like a lot for small municipalities, but it's not a lot if you look at it in the perspective of larger municipalities. We're doing this as sort of a tiger team approach. Again, we're then taking this to account that we're going to have these cycles of improvement. We recognize that by end of 25, we'll have our housing needs report, OCP, and zoning bylaw done, and then schedule those updates every 5 years to meet provincial legislation, and that creates a team. So that zoning team, that bylaw team, will remain in place forevermore. So now this team we've created specifically to OCP and zoning bylaw is part of our department, and it wouldn't change. It wouldn't be reallocated to anything else. So this basically is just a quick summary, I guess, of where we're going with in terms of the OCP, as I mentioned. One of the key components that led us to this as well is that with funding from UBCM, we took a DAP process, Development Approval Review, and that started us on this journey a couple years ago. So we got $500,000 from UBCM. We hired some consultants, we got some staff allocation, and really thought about how we could do development differently in Burnaby, and that started us on this road early, and that was very fundamental how we thought about this process differently than before. So this basically takes me somewhat to the end of the presentation, and love to have questions later on, but really I think that the challenges and opportunities that arise out of this legislation, of course the volume of the new legislation, regulations, and guidelines is daunting for everyone. It's overwhelming, there's not a lot of staff resources to deal with it. The timelines are ridiculous, both in terms of 2024 and 2025 adoption of changes is very problematic to most. The lack of broad-based consultation on the legislation was concerning for council. Council felt that they weren't consulted directly, and I think this was a little bit of a choice on behalf of the province. They consulted with some staff, they consulted with industry, and they brought it out. The intention of that was not to pull the rug out from under council, was say, here's the problem, you find the solution. And that's kind of the approach that we've taken. What's the solution that suits Burnaby best? And how do we sort of adopt to that? And then again, the big issue for council is the imposition of land use in local governments was an overreach from council's mind. Implementing TOAs specifically and being agnostic as to whether it affects agricultural land or other areas that may not be suitable for high density development was a concern for council. But, you know, staff kind of took this and realized, you know, we don't have a choice. How are we going to plan around this? And we really have taken the positive approach that this is a generational change in land use policy. This is the most fundamental change in provincial legislation when it comes to land use policy in 30 plus years. And it's our opportunity now to adapt that into a better community to live in, right? So it really got us focusing on the core needs of housing, economy, environment, services, and amenities. If those are the core, that feeds into our OCP, that feeds into our zoning bylaw, that feeds into the policies we create. Some of the other noise and policies start to dim down, and how do we address those core needs now, right? And then sort of attempt new solutions with the knowledge that change is a given. So what I mean by that is that we put forward an idea like form-based code and see how it's going to work, test it out, test it with the industry. If it does not work, we're fully cognizant of the fact we might have to update our zoning bylaw and go back to a GFA and FAR approach. We're not fearful of that need to change. Trying something now is more important than failing to try anything at all. The big item I leave you with is that for the first time in my career with City Burnaby, I've been there for 22 years, we're talking to each other. I'm talking to planners in Vancouver and Coquitlam and New Westminster and Richmond to get ideas of how we're dealing with this change. And a lot of times we sit in silos and we think we have all the answers. This is a great opportunity to link to other planners to find those solutions, borrow from their thoughts. So I think this is a really good opportunity for us to talk to each other and actually see some of that major generational change to happen. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Johannes. And next up, we have Timothy. Timothy Luck is a barrister and solicitor at Young Anderson. He's originally from Edmonton, and he holds a Master's of Arts in Political Science from the University of Alberta and a Juris Doctor and Master's in Community and Regional Planning from UBC. Timothy was first called to the bar in Alberta in 2012, and prior to joining Young Anderson, worked in private practice at a medium-sized firm in Edmonton and as in-house counsel for a major national insurer. Timothy has appeared before provincial and superior courts in BC and Alberta. Timothy maintains a general solicitor's practice with a focus on land use planning and development. Timothy's legal experience and training as a planner gives him unique insights into the needs of local government clients, allowing him to provide meaningful advice and guidance. Please welcome Timothy.
All right, let's see if I can get myself set up here without destroying this. Thank you very much for that lovely intro. Not something I think about much these days. I'm a little too focused with the new Bill 44, 46, 47 amendments, but yeah, there was a time once when I was a litigator, and I had very little to do with municipal planning. But in amongst that career, I realized that I didn't really love what I was doing, and ended up going to planning school to sort of gain some new insight into what else I could be doing, and it ended up being this, which is sort of a lawyer, planner, and I really enjoy it. And so it's always fun to be able to talk to other planners, as I love the language of planning, and I enjoy talking about what could be. And so today, right in line with planning, I'm going to be talking a bit about engagement, specifically the removal of public hearings as an option in certain circumstances when adopting new bylaws. And I guess to start, sorry, I don't have slides. I'm not very good at making them, and I didn't want to subject you to whatever it is I'd produce, so I'll just be trying to hammer information at you verbally. As I'm sure most of you are aware now, one of the changes in this draft of legislation is the removal of public hearings as an option in certain circumstances. That's section 464 of the Local Government Act. That section is entitled when a public hearing is required. Interestingly enough, it's also going to tell us when it's prohibited. To start with, a public hearing is still required when adopting a bylaw for certain zoning bylaws, an OCP, and that's adoption of an OCP or an amendment, and the cancellation of a land use contract, which we don't really deal with a lot anymore. There is the option also where a public hearing is not required, meaning that a local government could have one, but doesn't need to. That's 464 sub 2, and it's when a official community plan is in effect and the bylaw that's being considered is consistent with the OCP. Maybe they needed to put that in there, maybe they didn't, because if the bylaw is not consistent with the OCP, then it requires a OCP amendment. But that will still, this is a situation where you can still have a public hearing. Where a public hearing is not permissible is when you have an OCP that covers the area, the zoning bylaw is consistent with that OCP, meaning you don't need to amend the OCP, and the two new caveats, sole purpose of the bylaw is to permit development that is in whole or in part residential, so we're talking housing, and that residential component is at least half the gross floor area of the buildings related to that development. And then there is a new, also sub 4 from 464, no public hearing for zoning bylaws where the sole purpose is compliance with the housing requirements in section 481 sub 3. And so these changes have come in because the province is seemingly trying to send a message to municipalities and local governments. They want zoning that permits certain, like small-scale, multi-use housing, and they want the barriers taken away. And so they are saying, get it done, and you're not allowed to have a public hearing, which might slow that down, I suppose. I think this messaging is sometimes explicit, it's sometimes implicit, but that's what they want. And so that is what's going to, that's the flavor of this new legislation. So a question that I know is being asked is, if there's no public hearing, can there still be engagement with your residents, engagement with the people who are going to be affected by these bylaws? Well, the first option that I'll present is the OCP. The provincial government has also made changes to OCP requirements, which I think underline that they also now expect the OCP to be your engagement. Start planning the OCP, focus it on housing. That's your engagement opportunity that I think the province is probably wanting local governments to engage with. So first off, the OCP is now mandatory. It was optional before, now all municipalities need it, and a number of regional districts as well, local governments generally. The provincial government wants that they want more thought placed into the OCP, and I'd say specifically with housing. Now that is not new. OCPs, prior to these changes, OCPs already required quite a bit of consideration with regards to housing needs. That's in fact the first mandatory item within an OCP. It's to address adequate, affordable, and accessible housing. OCPs also require a housing needs report, and those requirements have changed as well. So first, the housing report now needs to be received every 5 years, and that begins at the end of 2028. So no later than December 31st, 2028, local governments need to have received a housing needs report. And the content of that housing needs report has changed as well, and the item that I'll point out is that it's now been extended to 20 years. So the provincial government wants OCPs to consider housing. They want it to be affordable, accessible, and adequate. And they want these local governments to think about them in the long term. And it's mandatory, again. So you have to consider housing needs. And so I'd say, like, consider your OCP as that form of long-term engagement. Because all these new zoning bylaws that no longer can consider, or can no longer have a public hearing, they can fall back on the OCP. That is an option for engagement. And because they need to be consistent with the OCP, you know that your engagement is kind of on point there. Other forms of engagement. You're not restricted to the OCP. One form of engagement that council could recommend or require be done is similar to the drafting of an OCP, but it can be done before first reading. So before the bylaw hits first reading, you can engage with the community and start getting information from them, feedback, those kind of things. I don't think that this is inappropriate, especially because a bylaw doesn't really exist until it's had at least first reading. So that's an option as well. It requires more forethought, obviously, and I think council was probably well informed by its staff as to what is the needed or what is the recommended types of engagement, but I think that's definitely an option. The other option, I suppose, is the public isn't really prohibited from certain types of engagement. So don't forget that even though this bylaw these bylaws don't require and cannot have a public hearing, it doesn't mean that the community is not going to see the notice. You still need to publish a notice that this bylaw is under consideration, what it includes, when first reading is set for, and I think that is implicitly an opportunity for the public to send in comments. I don't know if it's necessarily advisable to offer up to highlight that as an opportunity to send in written submissions. Written submissions is one of the components of a public hearing. And so are you having a partial public hearing if you do that? If you engage, like if you invite that? I don't know. I'll just say that I know that once a notice comes out, you can receive those letters, you can receive those in correspondence. And I think that's another form of engagement. It still exists, even if it's not explicit. And then lastly, there's just, I think it's very evident that the province doesn't want you to hold a public hearing. And so the fact that there's a prohibition is something that you can probably fall back on. It's not necessarily the answer you want if you want lots of engagement. Again, you've got your OCP, you've got the potential for other things, but clearly they don't want a public hearing. So recommendation is don't have one. All right, what happens if you do hold a public hearing? I'm not really sure what happens, and I think it's going to be fact dependent. It seems to me that it would be a bit strange for a court to say that you've engaged, you've had a public hearing, you've heard from the public, you adopted a bylaw, now you have to repeal it. That bylaw is ultra various because you did it in a manner that's not fair. I don't know. It's possible. I think a more likely scenario that you could get into trouble is if you have a public hearing of some sort and then the bylaw is not adopted. And if you came here for case law, I pulled up a case today. It's PSD Enterprises and New Westminster, citations 2012 BCCA 319. It involves a situation where there was a land transaction going on. A property owner had entered into a purchase and sale agreement, and one of the conditions was a bylaw rezoning past third reading. And it did, and so they waived conditions, and so the purchase and sale agreement was in force. And then the property owner, because it hadn't been adopted yet, the property owner went and talked to council and ended up being a delegate in front of council and spoke on this issue, and council wasn't sure if they could, like, it's new information, did they need to have another public hearing? And the advice they got was yes. And so they went and had another public hearing and decided not to adopt the bylaw. And so now this person had waived their conditions, was forced to have this sale, but they couldn't get their rezoning. And so there are real circumstances where the situation, whether you have consultation, public hearing or not, could have consequences, and it'll be very fact dependent. And the last thing I'll mention is embedded in there in this, when you can't have a public hearing, is where the bylaw's sole purpose is to do X. So residential purposes and at least 50% of the development. I think when it comes to reviewing the sole purpose, it will be a matter of, I think there'll be deference to council. They kind of decide what the sole purpose of that bylaw was. But it might be an opportunity where you want to embed something into the purpose of the bylaw. There's usually a bylaw statement, what this bylaw is meant to do. And so that could be an opportunity to set out in writing what the intention is. I don't know of any case law related to sole purpose investigation by a court, judicial review, but I suspect with Vavlov there's going to be deference to that. All right, I think that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you for that, Timothy, a super helpful overview. Next up, we have Ian Holl, the Development Planning Manager and Approving Officer for Sechelt. Ian Holl is a registered professional planner and has been in the Development Planning Manager and Approving Officer for Sechelt for 5 years, and before that, he worked for the Squamish-Lillooet Regional District for 9 years. Welcome, Ian.
Thank you. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about, we're a little bit more site-specific here. I mean, we're still grappling with our own broader zoning amendment, but we had an opportunity to consider these regulations on a site-specific basis. We had a rezoning application on a property shown here, about 2,800 square meters in total. The application came in just before the regulations were announced, and we kind of thought, well, why continue to rezone this property when we're going to have to rezone it again several months later. So we kind of started with this struggle where we have the applicant's proposal was just a simple 8-lot subdivision, single story, ranchers, no secondary suites. They're basically just the simplest they could possibly do. So when we start thinking, okay, now here's our opportunity to apply the small scale multi-unit housing regulations, we're getting into a conflict with a portion of the development community that doesn't want to do that. They have no interest in that. They have a vision of low density housing, and yet we're sort of being pushed towards a larger density situation. So, for the zoning that we eventually got them on board, and the applications moving forward. So what we're kind of doing is basically just drawing from the provincial manual, kind of throwing things in, kind of like Johannes has talked about, just getting something in place that works and kind of throwing it into how we have our zones drafted up. So putting in all the different uses, capturing that again through density, all the different parameters in terms of all the different types of dwelling units you can have and configurations, and just kind of putting that in the bylaw. And this would be the first sort of test of what that would look like. One thing we are doing, in terms of floor area ratio, we have a OCP amendment that we're undertaking now to kind of update some of our density parameters overall in terms of residential and commercial zones. We've got a lot of outdated units per hectare regulations, and we're kind of ditching the units per hectare and moving entirely to floor area ratio. So that's where some of these FAR numbers are kind of being informed a little bit from. But one thing we proposed for this particular lot, because it's a vacant property, and there's this big push provincially and federally for housing, is thinking, well, we have to establish a maximum density, we have to allow up to 4 units. Why don't we require a minimum density? Because it is a vacant property, there's nothing there. And we have a developer's original vision that they just want to put, houses on there with no suites. If we're not looking at saying, okay, well, we're not eliminating the single-family dwelling, but if somebody's going to build single-family dwellings, we at least like them to put in a suite from the beginning. So that's where this provision was put in there, not to restrict it to any particular housing form, but say if you're going to do X, we want at least 2 dwelling units on the property, whether that's a house with a suite or a duplex or some other mix of 2 units. So that was another struggle to kind of overcome with the developer, and they've since come on board with that idea. But it kind of begs the question of, for other communities where you have a mix of developers of different types, a lot of whom may just be single-family home builders, and that's what they do, that's what they know. So the province might have an expectation that, zoning's the problem, we're going to fix that, rezoning's out of the way, public hearings are out of the way, we're going to have this renaissance of multiplex buildings. But in lots of communities, Sechelt's only 10,000 people. The development and building community may not be on board with that, separate from any financing issues. So this is sort of a first test of like us trying to achieve a minimum density kind of transition on a vacant property. Obviously, we're already kind of dealing with the issues of if we apply this across the board and you have properties that have houses on them already, what if they burn down? Now we're getting into non-conforming issues. That's a whole nother can of worms that we're probably not going to open. But this idea that, at least for vacant properties, why don't we try to set some minimum targets as well? Another piece that we're looking at, our parking regulations are quite conservative. And as we go down in lot size, thinking about, okay, as part of this proposed zone, could we reduce our parking? We don't have anywhere near the frequent transit of the Lower Mainland, and most places you still need at least 1 car, but in order to kind of support some of this development, could we reduce parking a little bit? And in this case, for these sort of smaller secondary suite detached units, going from 1 to half a space, and other units from 2 down to 1, so kind of cutting the parking regulations in half. Who knows, that might create worse problems on our streets. We don't know yet, but that's kind of trying to grapple at some of that. We still need to have some level of parking here. And then to take a step back, the property that we were dealing with this rezoning is in the sort of the upper left corner here, but we have several areas like this that are these large blocks where technically they're all within the sanitary sewer service area. They're within the SCRD, the regional district's water service area. There are actually at least water lines running through most of this area, but there's no sewer lines and really no roads. So we have a big gap area where we're kind of left with, what do we do with these areas? Do we pre-zone them because technically they're in a service area and therefore eligible, but not really until such time as the infrastructure is dealt with? Or do we say, no, it's not feasible yet because nobody could incrementally do anything to extend the sewer line several hundred meters and build a new road and do all the things that they would need to do to get the 4 units on their property. So do we then just leave it zoned what it is now, and until such time as the district has done the capital planning to service this entire area, and then rezone at a later date? And for certainly Sechelt, we have a whole bunch of these areas where, again, they're in serviced areas, but the infrastructure just isn't there, and there's no way that individual property owners could incrementally develop this or pay the full cost of trying to serve this area. So we're left with a challenge of, how do we deal with that? And that's kind of it, what I have. I mean, I can go into a few more details of what our proposed zone looks like, but basically that's kind of where we're at in terms of, we have this rezoning test that we're kind of growing through, but still kind of grappling with these larger issues when, for the whole district, we have urban areas, we have rural areas, and everything in between where some have services, some don't services, and we don't have a good sense of how to deal with that at this time. So I'm all done for now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much to the presenters, and I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Jess, who will facilitate the Q&As. We have about 15 minutes, so yeah, feel free to raise your hand, and the panelists will take your questions.
Great, so yeah, raise your hand if you have a question, and we've got some roaming mics as well. Great.
Two of the speakers hit on a couple of points that I think are fairly critical. First, the honorable member from Burnaby. How the hell did you get 8 R zones? And if I may, just as a comment, I'm an architect as well as a planner. If I go to the building code, I can come up with 3 stories as a first limiter in the code. Never understood, by the way, why houses have to be 2.5 stories, but houses joined together can be 3. 6 stories, it's kind of essentially replaced 4 stories as an option. 18 stories in the new code for encapsulated mass timber. And after that, anything. So how do you get R2 to R8?
That's a great question. So a mix of it is what we think is the right response to character, and exactly as you mentioned, what's a response to the code and legislation. So where building code has 6, 18, and then non-combustible. We brought our districts to meet those. So, as we get out of the R1 multiplex district, which has a height of 3.5, we get into 6. Actually, it's not true. I think that from an urban design response, we recognized that there was a need to look at a differentiation in form from multiplex to townhouse. And so where we see ground-oriented townhouse, that becomes a form. That allows for 4 stories, sort of stacked townhouse. 4-story apartment form, again, relating to as we see a gradient from our higher density areas down, we artificially brought in these scales. So multiplex townhouse, 4-story, 6-story, 12-story, 18, 20, 30, 40, 50 plus, right? So Burnaby doesn't have an issue with height. In doing that, we created a gradient throughout the city as we really tried to focus on the fact that while we were already transit-oriented in our planning framework, we had new TOAs brought upon us that we had to plan for. And so we're going through that now of how we scale between these areas. And one of the things we don't want to create is the criticism that we're just towers in Burnaby. We want to create neighborhoods that have different characters, and those different characters relate to different family types. And so trying to create areas that maybe, doing an analysis yesterday, is what is our walk shed to a school? What is the housing form we want to see outside of our town centers to school? So we really focused on how do we create townhouse frontage onto parks or townhouse frontage onto school sites, and that's where some of those land uses and ultimately dictated the form.
Just a quick follow-up. You gave setbacks a glancing blow. Yeah. Again, it's one of the biggest wastes of urban land is the front yard covered in grass. A lot of old bylaws still, you have to have 50% grass so you can waste potable water. So I think, again, the building code has setbacks that deal with side yards especially, but are you looking at setbacks as a place to claw back usable urban land?
That's a great point. It's exactly that. So really looking at it, what are the 2 measures that we would then create a volume of density to be built within? Height and setback. You could use a coverage as a bulk and massing tool, but coverage could be dictated, as you said, by impervious surface. So we have a impervious surface component that says you can't have more than 70% impervious surface. So we can take coverage out of the conversation. Let's look at a 4.5 meter setback, 15 foot from all yards, and height then. And so then you create this unmolded slab of clay, and then you use your development guidelines in your DP areas to determine the form, and that ultimately then informs the density. So really taking it to the very fundamental elements of setback, height, and that's it.
Minimize. I did do form-based code courses in the States a few years back. I think they work well for some local, neighborhood main streets, if you will, and things like that. Not sure they're the answer for the problems we're facing right here. For the gentleman from Sechelt, you mentioned FAR. I've been a planner, I don't know, Dave, probably for 30 years. I have yet to figure out what the public interest is in measuring FAR.
Good question, I guess. Where at the moment, at least at the OCP level, we're trying to move away from the units per hectare, partly because it's been an impediment for a whole number of recent rezonings in our downtown area, where they've all had to have OCP amendments just because they're hitting the sort of units per hectare density limits. And so that stimulated ultimately this amendment to kind of do away with the units per hectare and move to FAR. Now, as part of the new zoning bylaw that we adopted a couple of years ago, we did bring in some of the FAR provisions into some of our residential and sort of more intensive zones, partly as just another parameter to provide some more detail on the box. But again, as we move forward, we may find that it's totally useless. I mean, we could say now that, for all those rezonings that we're running into the units per hectare problem, never were hitting up against our FAR limits that we had. So nobody was ever pushing that limit. So it may ultimately, over the next few years, prove to be a useless measure, or just not something that's not giving any value. Certainly, I would agree with Johannes in terms of setbacks, height, lot coverage, and things like that. I mean, those are obviously key parameters, and we're grappling with that too as we try to fit in all these single-family neighborhoods. I mean, Sechelt is 95% plus single-family dwellings. You have little pockets of duplexes and some townhouses here, but this is going to be a big transition for lots of areas, and also then this idea of how do we streamline the development permit process. We're not inundated with many applications for duplex just because it was a duplex and not a single-family home.
Great, thank you so much. Do we have any other questions? Okay, I'm going to go to the different table and then we can come back to you.
Thank you. Hi, I guess this is for Johannes possibly if anyone else has any comments on it. I'm an environmental planner, and so I care a lot about like the environmental development permit areas and water course DPAs, and so I'm really kind of struggling to understand how those might be impacted by some of these things. I think I saw it on one of your slides that you had something about an exemption for riparian areas, but yeah, just kind of curious about that side of things.
No, that's critical, and that's a really good question. I appreciate it. So when looking at, it's really a trifecta or a quad, whatever the quad of a trifecta is, looking at the legislation and how we sort of roll it out. So the development permit areas are critical to how we then do our zoning. Zoning is critical to how we do our housing needs and our OCP and vice versa. So when it comes to the zoning and the form and the imposition of the TOAs, we dug through there and said, oh, look, there is an opportunity to look at environmental impacts, compliance with wrapper, and being able to then determine what is considered suitable or not. Now, I might get kickback on this, but we're going forward with the TOA designation bylaw with certain exemptions for SPIA areas, streamside protection enhancement areas, that they aren't suitable to meet either small-scale multi-unit to its full extent or TOA for these reasons, and then we'll provide our bylaw rationale. So we have an adopted bylaw in addition to wrapper that has specified top-of-bank setbacks, and that we wouldn't be able to achieve the form of development with those prescribed setbacks, or there'd be a substantial impact to the habitat, right? So that's the way that we're working is you have your streamside protection DP, which we're going to be bringing in. We used a bylaw approach previously. That'll be our new sort of permit type, in addition to the zoning bylaw there to try to ensure that we're protecting those areas. But it's critical. So we look at either issues related to streamside enhancement or even agricultural, and take a look at how we can sort of nuance the legislation by still meeting it while informing what we could do to ensure there's environmental sustainability approach taken.
Okay, thank you.
Great, I think this gentleman here, and then I'm going to move over to this side of the room. Right there, table 9.
Hi, I'm with the Richmond School District, and one of the concerns that we have is the haphazard nature of some of the development in some of the neighborhoods that could happen. It could have impact on the character and form of neighborhoods. Obviously, development permit guidelines may help with that, but what's the power of government to deny a development if it conforms to the official community plan? So those are, there's two I'm asking both the legal people and the planners. As an urban planner myself, I know about development guidelines for haphazard environmental areas and heritage areas and so forth. But in terms of this new density provision, it allows development to occur in neighborhoods where there could be impacts and people will have some concerns. So NIMBYism is dead, and the council's decision to deny a development basically is nullified in a sense if it conforms with the official community plan. So everything is driven by the OCP, which is driven by the housing legislation. And what that creates is it's hard for us as planners at school districts to estimate the impact on the neighborhood in terms of how quickly that development will occur and what that form of that development will be.
Your question is how does the council say no to this kind of development? I think that is going to be quite fact specific, because we know that they can't use their powers they can't deny that. But I think when it's perhaps, I don't know the answer to your question, and I'm reluctant to speculate too much, but I think if there's external considerations, I think servicing could be one of them. That's where a council might have more leverage to say, no, we're not doing this, and it's not related to housing or something along those lines, or a desire not to, this NIMBYism, where it's perhaps a little bit more concrete. I think might be a good test case somewhere out there, and it's going to be based on some pretty objective considerations.
And I can't speak for Richmond, and I know that every municipality treats it differently. Our first meeting after December was council, our second one was school district. So we met with the board, and we said, this is what the legislation says. This is where your school locations are. We want to sit down with your staff, and as a result of the legislation, we need to review our OCP land use framework. Where do we want new schools to meet the anticipated growth in these areas? It's beyond our control. And so even before we went out to the public to say, and people are freaked out, like I'll give you an example, if you go along the Millennium Line on Lougheed Highway in Burnaby, you have industrial districts. To the north of Lougheed Highway, you have single-family residential. To the south, that now have 5 FAR densities on single-family lots that weren't anticipated by the city. We need a new school in the government road area, right beside Michael Bublé's house, to accommodate that growth. And so we met with the school district, and we've started to pre-plan just locations. The catch-22 is that you guys don't have any additional funding mechanism. Updates to the school site acquisition charge haven't been made to fund the new growth that's necessary for these schools. So again, I don't want to sort of put this out there too much, but we're looking to partner with the school district to say, how can we procure land and maybe then make up that transition and the sale of city land for school sites, because we can't accommodate the growth if we don't have the schools and the places for kids to go. So we have to plan in concert. This will be the first thing that your planners go towards is the school district. So.
Thank you so much. Okay, this side of the room, there's 2 hands at the back.
I'm interested in, I think it's called Smoosh, and I'm sorry, I'm catching up on a lot of this stuff compared to probably many people here, but how much do you actually anticipate it changing? My understanding is places in California, other places that have tried some of this broad legislation, it's actually been fairly slow, the actual uptake. And so that, and then the second part related, I guess, is how are you dealing with the servicing aspects of those? And I think it's really for Johannes. I think it's less so for Sechelt.
Sure, yes. It's funny because in creating the updated DCC and ACC bylaws, we had to project out what we thought small-scale multi-unit housing would be. Maybe erroneously, we took our total number of single-family applications per year over a 5-year trend, and then projected that if half of those were to be developed as small-scale multi-unit, that could be our projection for that number of units. It's not science. It's literally alchemy. It could be more, it could be less, but it gives us a median to sort of work with. That then determined a certain unit count, it determined a certain sewer capacity and water load, and then we adjusted our DCC rates to match. we're going to have to front end a lot of that and go through a latecomers process to cover the cost of those services. The hardest part is that it's not in an overall district plan. Like right now, we knew exactly where our town centers and urban villages were. We had all the trunk sewers in place. We work with Metro Vancouver. These are single-family areas that were serviced in the 1950s. And so what that means is that bringing service from a trunk to that neighborhood is going to be really on our dime, and have to recoup that through the DCC over the 25-year horizon of that charge.
Thank you. I have to say, smush is a new one. I have heard smur and smooze, so I'll add that to the repertoire. Any other questions on this side? Yep.
I'll try SMA, if that works for people. I think this will be a really interesting implementation. As the former director of planning with the city of North Vancouver, we did quite a bit of small lot development, and my experience was that about 10 feet of a front yard setback, or 3 meters, gives you a pretty comfortable relaxation from 25 feet to 10, and it gives people a chance to have some open space that's usable. You need about a 10-foot square to have usable open space, and enough space to keep your blinds open when someone's walking along the street. So the 2 meters in the guidelines worry me as not being very livable or very accessible for open space, a patio space in front of the unit, because I think these will be intended to be ground-orientated units. And the other is to speak to well, think like a 0 setback on the side yard would be pretty horrendous for a neighbor. If you're doing 2 lots at the same time, I guess that could work. But the FSR question is a very interesting one, and there's sort of it's topical to talk about form-based zoning now, which kind of creates an envelope and you sort of go wild inside of it and figure out what you want to do. My experience on these small lot projects is you're not going to get big-scale developers with professional architects. You're going to get builders that come in, and they're going to get sites based upon what they pay for the land. So the land will go to the highest bidder, and the person that's going to put the most square footage on the site will be able to pay the most because they can sell it for the most. So it reminds me of an RM3A1 zone in Vancouver that was around for many years, and they created an envelope in that zone that was, it was sort of a small lot apartment site. And so they had setbacks to the front and truncated angles to the front and rear. And the FAR filled the entire envelope. So every building in the RM3A1 zone looks exactly the same with some decorations architecturally. So in effect, the building envelope was the building design, and that is not the intention of a building envelope. So I think there's very valid reason for an FAR. It really controls mass, and you need to have an envelope large enough to give designers lots of flexibility to fit that in. So I look to the Vancouver densification of small lot areas as being very effective from what I've seen, the ones that came out late last year. But I think FAR is going to be very important. I'll be very curious to see how it evolves for those municipalities that simply go with the small standards that are in the provincial guidelines.
Okay. Anyone in the middle from these tables? I don't think we've heard from these tables yet. No? Okay, I saw a hand right up at the back. Yeah.
Okay, so my question is about public hearings. Under Bill 44, public notices are still required if a public hearing is not being held for a project. Our work with Renovate the Public Hearing, looking at public hearing reform, has found that the requirement to still send out through a mailer notice to property owners and occupiers within the 100-meter radius of the subject property has actually resulted in a great amount of confusion, and having residents show up to delegate on specific applications at council meetings. Can you speak to whether or not there would be some legal jeopardy around this? Timothy, and then Johannes, can you speak to maybe how Burnaby has navigated that?
Legal jeopardy to that. Well, I guess one thing I'll note is that that renovate the public hearing. I think that work is still ongoing, and I think the public hearing is an important sort of component. Conceptually, I really like it as an opportunity for like democratic engagement with these issues, and the public hearing now suffers from a lot of legal case law and how it needs to be undertaken. So I think the the idea is great. Specific to legal jeopardy of sending out notices and then ending up getting delegations. I think that it's within a council's power to not hear a delegation that's on a topic that they're not supposed to have a public hearing on, and the basis being we're not supposed to have a public hearing, so we're not gonna hear about this. And actually, in that case I was talking about, the New West and PSD Enterprises, the public notice in that said council will not be hearing from the public after the public hearing. So don't send in any more information after that date. So it might be advisable to put that into your notice that we're not hearing delegations on this. I guess maybe, and then it's up to the public if they wanna, if they can figure out that that still means you can write in.
That's a great point. So since December, we haven't held public hearings for residential projects, commercial and industrial projects. We've only had 2 public hearings on an OCP amendment and an HRA. So nobody showed up to those, which is great. But with respect to the notification period, so we still notify, our bylaws 20 meters from the property. It's not very big, but that's the requirement. It gets mailed out, notice on the site, information on the city's website. So what we've done now is switched the date. So where we'd have notification of a public hearing being held, we have notification of first and second reading of the rezoning amendment bylaw. And so what we then do is we would then receive that notification and summarize it in the first and second reading report now, which otherwise would have been called the public hearing report. Gives council a summary of what we've heard. There is no ability for the public to come as a delegation at that council meeting. You can apply to appear as a delegation on a topic, but not related to the item on the agenda that night. So it does separate the two. And we've received those. We have an upcoming process in Brentwood Mall, and people are quite upset about the change of form, and we've received a lot. Now, one concern that we have is that the prohibition on receiving new information post-public hearing, without having a public hearing, it doesn't limit when information can be provided to council. So we could get a deluge of responses prior to final adoption that could adjust council's perspective on whether they support or not support that rezoning amendment. That's interesting to us because we were really approval in principle at second reading of the rezoning application post-public hearing, and we could move on towards those prerequisite conditions and complete the rezoning. Now, there's a bit of fear that maybe at third reading or final adoption, the rezoning could be quashed based on information provided by the public because there's no longer that prohibition on receiving new information.
That's interesting. Thank you. We got one more question, and then we're going to go to a health break. Yeah.
Thanks. I was interested in hearing, Johannes, your initial supply projection calculation, which is great to know, and then also hearing from both yourself and Ian about incrementalism and this being an initial approach with the expectation that you're likely to be amending over time, which is fantastic. I would love to hear a bit more about what your thinking is around what would trigger amendments. Are there certain supply projections that you're also intending to hit around certain timelines per housing type? And I'm particularly interested in SMU as well.
Are we thinking about amendments to bylaws, OCP, DCC, ACC, or all the above?
The regulations within them, yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, again, it's not that we're good little boys and girls, but we recognize that this maybe is an opportunity for City of Burnaby to get more organized in how we update our policies. And if you are that interested in reviewing what we have a 1965 bylaw that's been materially changed over time, but it still has a bylaw adoption date of 1965. We have an OCP last changed in 1998. Most of our neighborhood plans are from the mid-90s. We don't touch them for 30 years. We don't look at them again. We apply them straight, or we just use CD zoning and disregard them and do whatever we want. That's not the right approach to land use planning. And so we've taken this to heart that now this cadence of 5-year reviews, we put it into the system. We have a tracker, we have a schedule, and we're going to then constantly review these policies. But what it meant is kind of being forthright and saying, we can't do this off the side of our desks. We need to create a group specifically that's going to deal with area land use plans, OCP amendment, you know, update projections for DCC, ACC, and now it's a team. And the city put resources towards doing that, so we make incremental land use planning and policy adoption a priority for the city. And it's now something, it's just not an option for everyone. If you only have a planning department of 5 people, it's hard to, but you almost have to then say one person is dedicated 100% of the time to deal with that incremental change over time.
As someone whose planning department is 5 people, Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that we're having to look at, I mean, we had an OCP update on the books prior to all these changes, but it's kind of cemented this idea of, you know, we're not going to be able to do a new OCP every 5 years, like not as in a brand new bylaw with like brand new everything. It's just going to have to be updates every 5 years informed by the housing and needs assessments that are now kind of raised as one of the primary things that you have to address. And then as part of that, maybe more regular updates to the zoning bylaws, just part of that lockstep of like, okay, we do our housing needs assessment, that informs OCP updates, that informs zoning bylaw updates as needed. So we're kind of in this situation now where, yeah, like we had a new zoning bylaw adopted at the end of 2022 that finally got rid of our 1987 zoning bylaw that had, you know, been unchanged relatively since 1987. So that was a big update for us. You know, one of the big changes there was on properties that were on sewer, we lowered the minimum lot size to have a second dwelling or like a small detached dwelling, had doubled the size of that dwelling. So there's about 1,000 new, or the potential for about 1,000 new of these detached dwelling units, but there hasn't been any kind of uptake on that really. So, you know, when we look at the SMU regulations, we can't imagine that there's going to be a similar explosion of uptake either. Like the costs are higher now than they were even at the end of 2022, so nobody's going to be running out and putting up duplexes and things, but it does, you know, highlight that there's more sort of regular incremental changes, and having to kind of put this on the books as part of your budgeting to go to council and say, look, this is something that the province is now requiring a much more regular, more intensive update that's going to take staff and consulting resources to kind of keep going. But at the same time, it could just be like, yeah, we do our housing needs update, we do an OCP update that's related to that, and maybe you're just having smaller updates over time.
Great, thank you so much. That's it for questions. Can we have a big round of applause for our three speakers, Timothy, Ian, and Johannes? Thank you so much. So we'll now have time for a 15-minute health break. There are snacks outside, I've heard on the grapevine, and we will be going into breakout groups for the second part of the session.